Most of the conspirators involved in Caligula's death were ensuingly spared, but those directly accountable for the murders of Caesonia and Julia were put to death as to ensure the safety of Caligula's remaining relatives. Claudius, furthermore, was quick to remind the Roman people of his familial ties to Germanicus, Augustus, Drusus, and anyone else who would help legitimize his own reign as princeps. And despite having been chosen uniquely by the Praetorians, Claudius was liked by many. Maybe because he wasn't Tiberius nor Caligula, maybe because he was viewed quite positively by many even before entering public life, or maybe simply because he was a good leader. The new emperor viewed and treated the armed forces quite fondly. He also returned control of the Macedonian and Achaean provinces back to the Senate, despite their hesitation to support him. The borders of the Roman Empire were furthermore expanded through Thrace, Lycia, Judea, Mauritania, and Noricum. And it was under Claudius that Britannia was truly invaded by Rome, and a province of Britannia was set up. Positive changes were thus made to the judicial system, reassertion of rights and respects for different religions, welcoming freedmen into his close ranks, supporting the expansion of Roman citizenship, freeing ill slaves who were abandoned by their masters, and preventing the murder of slaves were all parts of the Claudius's governing plan. So was appeasing the Senate, although that didn't mean he wasn't also critical of his senators when he saw it necessary. He even had a handful killed, generally in response to plots and conspiracies of his assassination or coups. At one point, even the contemporary wife of the emperor, Messalina, and her daringly public lover, Gaius Silius, were also executed for their own involvement in a scheme against Claudius. The princeps then wed Agrippina the Younger, a niece of his and a member of the Julian family. Following the marriage, Claudius adopted Agrippina's son, Lucius Domitius Aenobarbus, and named the young man co-heir, alongside the emperor's own Britannicus, who was still a boy. Lucius was additionally wed to Octavia, a daughter of Claudius, to further secure the unity of the two families and Agrippina's son's claim as Claudius's heir. This latter point, however, may have been the cause of Emperor Claudius's downfall. On October 13th, 54 BC, in the early hours of the morning, as the sun still fought the moon for dominion over the skies, Claudius breathed his final breath. Historians of the time blame Agrippina explicitly for his suffering end, accusing her of poisoning the elderly ruler in order to secure her son's place at the helm of the Roman Empire before Britannicus reached majority. This would be a likely explanation, though some still insist that natural causes killed Claudius. Either way, the emperor was dead, and his son was still too young to be crowned in his place. Agrippina and Lucius had gotten their wish, but the latter was about to embark on a reign that would be short, blood-stained, and one of the most haunting eras of Roman history. With the death of Claudius came the ascension of Emperor Nero. Just as with some of his successors, Nero was adored by the Roman people in his early reign. Only 16 years old, Nero had little affection for the office of emperor, and in fact, saw himself more of a poet and performer than a ruler of such a place as great as Rome. Perhaps this is why, in his first years at the helm, he was focused on erasing corruption, restoring power to the Senate, and eliminating the treason trials that had so plagued previous reigns. Nero is also said to have favored Greek wrestling over gladiatorial games, boosted the rights of slaves, slashed taxes, and overall took an approach that the Roman people and Senate hesitantly approved of. The only person at this point in time who seemed to be developing a rather negative view of the emperor was his own mother. Agrippina, from the very start, had hoped to rule through her young son, and thus had political opposition murdered, manipulated others, and tried to insert herself into the spotlight alongside Nero. But as the boy grew older and bolder, Agrippina began to feel that he was starting to distance himself from her. In her own scandalous fashion, Agrippina responded by threatening to support Britannicus instead of her own son, which led to the poisoning of Claudius's only other heir. Agrippina then attempted to build a stronger relationship with her daughter-in-law Octavia, having already discovered that Nero was having a sordid affair with a freedwoman named Claudia Acte. This pushed Nero even further away from his mother's side. He knew now that Agrippina was more of an overbearing nuisance than an actual aid to his reign, and thus had her exiled. By 59 AD, the situation had escalated to Nero's utter breaking point, now involved in a new affair with a woman named Poppaea Sabina. It's theorized that this affair fans the flames of a growing feud between Agrippina and her son, as the former had grown quite fond of Octavia. But Nero found himself much happier with his mistress than his wife. The emperor, having lost all patience with his mother, first attempted to send her off on a ship that was destined for sinking. When Agrippina extraordinarily survived the shipwreck and made it back to shore, Nero simply had her stabbed to death and attempted to convince the public that it had been a suicide. Now, with his meddling mother out of the way, Nero left the running of the empire to his advisors, Burrus and Seneca. This gave the ruler the freedom to pursue his real pleasures, the arts. Poetry, theater, music, and even painting delighted the young man. This seems to be the perfect plan for the reluctant princeps. He could utilize his status as emperor to please his fancy, whilst putting off the actual work for his advisors to handle without him. That is, of course, until the death of Burrus in 62 AD made things a bit more difficult. It seems that after his mother's murder and then losing one of the men he relied so heavily on to do his own job for him, Nero became another level unhinged. It was this same year that Poppaea would fall pregnant with the emperor's baby, dragging Nero into a new scandal. Desperate to keep his mistress while saving his reputation, he reacted by divorcing and exiling Octavia, whom he accused of being infertile. The public, having up until this point rather liked their emperor, protested this act and called for Nero to undo his decision. Doubling down, the ruler instead accused Octavia of having had her own affair, which he used to justify her execution. Nero was now free, at least technically, to marry his pregnant mistress, and so he did. This satisfied the emperor, at least until 65 AD, when Poppaea, pregnant again after her first child with Nero had died in infancy, died. Whether this was at the hands of a rage-driven Nero in the heat of an argument, or from natural causes of a childbirth or miscarriage complication, is unknown. Nevertheless, the emperor was clearly devastated by the loss of his beloved. Her funeral was extravagant and grander than most tradition, and Nero's downward spiral into deep insanity was alarmingly accelerated. 2 years after his wife's death, the emperor had spotted a young freedman, Sporus, who he alleged looked exactly like Poppaea. He thus had the boy seized, castrated, and dressed in the deceased's clothing. Nero went so far as to wed Sporus, falling into a startling fantasy world where his dead bride was living once more. All of this, in addition to Nero's growing love of the arts and now public performances on stage, coupled with his increasingly odd and dishonorable behaviors, led Seneca, the only remaining advisor that Nero could push his responsibilities off to retire. Still, Nero enjoyed himself whenever he could, and frequently traveled outside of Rome. And it was on one of these trips that Rome went up in flames. The Great Fire of Rome would last for a week straight, erupting on July 18th in the dark of the night and ripping through the streets, homes, and temples of the city as the wind whipped the flames this way and that. Whether the fire had been started at Nero's order or not is unclear, but either way, after the fire had finally been snuffed out, construction began to rebuild the burnt-down sections of Rome in a new, extravagant style to accompany a large and lavish palace for the emperor himself. Realizing that this was causing his own people to blame him for the devastating blaze, Nero desperately searched for a scapegoat, and he landed on the Christians. The torture and eradication techniques he would consequently utilize to punish the Christians of Rome would be so horrific and vile that even the Roman pagans would condemn their ruler, and many of them thought that Nero may have been the Antichrist. Despite maintaining some level of popularity and success in the East, Nero's reign by now was all but doomed. He was becoming increasingly hated by both the Senate and the people, and a growing number of conspiracies were swirling around the realm. The emperor would have some of his senators, alongside philosophers, knights, and others who plotted against him, executed, but not all. And it seems that killing all was becoming less and less possible. It seems that now everyone was against him. In the spring of 68 AD, a provincial governor by the name of Gaius Julius Vindex would be the first to reach his limit with the debauching, persecuting, deranged princeps. Vindex declared himself to be in rebellion against Nero, and in a genius ploy, publicly aligned himself with the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, Servius Sulpicius Galba, who had not himself even joined a rebellion. After being declared an enemy of Rome in response, Galba had little to lose, and in due course declared himself to be in open rebellion against Nero as well. This was the heftiest domino to fall, and it was from this moment in time that the clock counting down the emperor's living days began to tick. Aware of his end nearing, yet still hopeful for a savior, Nero woke up in the middle of the night to find his palace starkly empty. The Praetorian Guard had left him. His own bodyguard had as well. His allies, his servants, his soldiers, everyone. Having failed to summon anyone throughout the entire palace, running aimlessly through the empty chambers and halls, Nero shouted distraughtly, "Have I neither friend nor foe?" After what must have felt like an eternity, the emperor finally found 4 loyal freedmen to accompany him as he frantically searched for a place to hide. The Senate had now declared Nero, their princeps, a public enemy. The whole of Rome, it appeared, was out for his blood. Having arrived at the villa of Phaon, another freedman who offered shelter, Nero ordered his few remaining friends to dig him a grave. Seemingly in the depths of a mental breakdown at the thought of all that was playing out, Nero began to mumble, "What an artist dies in me," repeatedly, as he paced around and begged one of the freedmen to either kill themselves to motivate his own suicide or to kill him. At long last, as the sound of his treasonous soldiers grew louder and nearer, likely by his own hand, Emperor Nero, only 30 years of age, was stabbed in the throat and collapsed to the floor. When the soldiers arrived and found him, blood-soaked and barely breathing, lying on the ground at their feet, Nero is believed to have triumphantly taunted, "Too late! This is fidelity." On June 9th, 68 AD, Nero and what remained of the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to a bitter, beastly end.